The morning sun painted golden streaks across the sidewalk of downtown San Diego as retired Navy SEAL Commander Ray settled into his favorite spot outside the Corner Cup Cafe. It was his daily ritual, a moment of peace before the city fully woke up. The gentle ocean breeze carried the smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries, mixing with the salty air that reminded him of countless missions at sea. His cane rested against the rustic wooden table, a constant companion since the helicopter crash 3 years ago. The accident had happened during a rescue mission in rough weather, the kind of mission he'd done countless times before. But that night was different. While successfully saving 3 stranded sailors, their Black Hawk had caught a nasty downdraft. Ray still remembered the violent spinning, the crash, and then darkness. He'd woken up in a military hospital with a leg that would never be quite the same. But Ray wasn't the type to let life's challenges keep him down. He'd adapted, just like he'd been trained to do. These peaceful morning moments at the cafe had become part of his new normal. The staff knew him well, not as the decorated SEAL he was, but as the kind regular who always left generous tips and had a warm smile for everyone. Today, like every other day, he sat with his steaming cup of black coffee and a freshly baked breakfast sandwich. He watched the city coming to life around him. Early morning joggers padding past, shop owners raising their shutters, and the occasional delivery truck rumbling by. The morning light caught his wedding ring as he lifted his coffee cup, bringing a small smile to his face as he thought about his wife and kids still sleeping at home. The cafe's owner, an elderly Vietnamese man who had served alongside American troops years ago, waved at him through the window. Ray waved back, appreciating these small, genuine connections that made civilian life meaningful. His military career had taught him to stay alert, to always be aware of his surroundings, but here, in this peaceful corner of the city, he could almost let his guard down. His phone buzzed quietly, probably a message from one of his former team members. They still kept in touch, supporting each other through the challenges of civilian life. The transition hadn't been easy for any of them, but they'd faced it together, just like they'd faced everything else. Ray took another sip of his coffee, savoring the rich flavor. His mind wandered to the youth mentoring session he had planned for later that day at the Veterans Center. Working with young people, sharing life lessons without the war stories, that had become his new mission. He found purpose in showing them that strength wasn't just about physical power or combat skills. It was about resilience, wisdom, and choosing the right path even when it wasn't the easiest one. The morning was perfect, calm, and promising. The kind of day that reminded him why he'd fought so hard to protect this way of life. Little did he know that this peaceful scene was about to change dramatically, testing not just his physical abilities, but the very principles he lived by. A distant rumble of motorcycles caught his attention, but he didn't give it much thought. San Diego was a big city after all, and the morning traffic was starting to pick up. He reached for his sandwich, ready to enjoy the simple pleasure of a good breakfast. The sun continued to climb higher in the sky, casting shorter shadows on the sidewalk, while the city hummed with increasing activity around him. The gentle whir of bicycle wheels, the click-clack of business shoes on pavement, the cheerful chatter of early morning customers, it was the symphony of ordinary life that he had helped protect for so many years. Ray breathed in deeply, grateful for another beautiful morning in America. He had no way of knowing that in just a few minutes, this ordinary morning would become anything but ordinary. The peaceful morning shattered as 3 thundering motorcycles rolled into the cafe's parking lot. Their engines revved unnecessarily loud, causing nearby pigeons to scatter and a young mother to hurriedly guide her child to the other side of the street. Ray didn't need to look up to know the type of attention they were trying to draw. He'd seen it many times before. The bikes were expensive customs, gleaming with chrome and leather, but deliberately made to look intimidating. Their riders, all wearing matching leather vests with questionable patches, cut their engines simultaneously. The sound of heavy boots hitting pavement echoed off the building walls as they dismounted. The leader, a tall man with a gray-streaked beard and arms covered in faded tattoos, spotted Ray immediately. A smirk crossed his weathered face as he nudged his 2 companions, both younger but trying hard to match their leader's threatening demeanor. They exchanged knowing looks, the kind that made the cafe owner slowly reach for his phone behind the counter. Well, what do we have here?" The leader's voice carried across the patio, loud enough to make other customers glance up from their phones and laptops. His companions flanked him as they approached, trying to look menacing but coming across more like actors in a bad movie. One cracked his knuckles, a gesture so cliché it would have made Ray laugh in different circumstances. Ray continued enjoying his breakfast, taking another bite of his sandwich with deliberate calm. His trained senses took in everything. The way the youngest biker's hand trembled slightly, betraying his nervous energy, how the third man kept looking around, checking if people were watching them. The leader's slight limp that suggested an old injury to his right knee. The morning sun caught the leader's rings as he adjusted his leather gloves. "Nice morning for breakfast," he said, his voice dripping with fake friendliness. "Though seems to me you might be in the wrong neighborhood." The younger bikers snickered on cue, like background actors following a script. A young waitress started to approach with a coffee pot, but the cafe owner gently called her back inside. Through the window, Ray could see him speaking quietly into his phone, likely calling the local police. Other customers began gathering their belongings, some hurrying away while others stayed, phones discreetly recording the scene. The air grew thick with tension as the bikers moved closer, their shadows falling across Ray's table. The leader planted his hands on the edge, making Ray's coffee cup rattle against its saucer. "You know," he growled, leaning in closer, "we've got a certain way of doing things around here. Certain traditions about who sits where." Ray noticed a fourth motorcycle rumbling past the cafe, slowing down briefly before continuing on. These guys had backup watching the scene. They'd done this before. The thought made something shift inside him, not fear but a familiar, focused calm. It was the same feeling he had countless times before missions, when everything became crystal clear. The youngest biker, trying to prove himself, reached for Ray's plate. "Looks like you're about done with that anyway," he sneered, his voice cracking slightly. The morning breeze carried the smell of leather and motorcycle exhaust, mixing with the lingering aroma of coffee and breakfast. From inside the cafe came the sound of chairs scraping against floor tiles. Two construction workers who'd been enjoying their breakfast biscuits stood up, their tool belts jingling as they moved closer to the window. A retired couple who came to the cafe every morning exchanged worry glances, the husband reaching for his cane. The scene was building to something ugly, like a storm gathering strength. But Ray had weathered far worse storms than this. His hand remained steady as he reached for his coffee cup, his movements unhurried and precise. Years of training had taught him that real power didn't need to announce itself. It was quiet, contained, and absolutely certain. The bikers mistook his calm for fear, his silence for weakness. They couldn't see the slight adjustments he'd made in his posture, the way he'd already mapped out every possible scenario in his mind. They had no way of knowing that they weren't dealing with an easy target, but with someone who had spent years mastering the art of controlling chaotic situations. As the tension peaked and the leader opened his mouth for another threat, a police siren wailed in the distance. But even before its echo reached them, something else was about to change the entire dynamic of this confrontation. These bikers were about to learn a lesson about appearances, and it wouldn't be the lesson they'd planned to teach that morning. The leader of the bikers deliberately knocked over Ray's coffee cup, sending hot liquid streaming across the table and onto the ground. The ceramic cup clattered but didn't break, spinning to a stop near the edge. "Oops," he said with a mock apology, "my hand slipped." His companions laughed on cue, but their laughter held a nervous edge. Ray watched the coffee drip off the table, his face unchanging. 15 years of special operations had taught him that the most dangerous moments often came disguised as simple choices. He could feel the weight of his cane against his leg, not just a walking aid, but a reminder of everything he'd survived to be sitting here this morning. "You know," Ray spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people naturally lean in to listen, "there's plenty of space here for everyone." He gestured to the empty tables around them. "Why don't you guys grab a coffee? First round's on me." The offer hung in the air, genuine despite the tension, giving them a chance to back down gracefully. The leader blinked, thrown off by the calm response. He'd expected fear, anger, or even pleading, reactions he knew how to handle. Instead, he found himself facing something unfamiliar, complete composure. "You think you can buy us off?" he growled, trying to regain control of the situation. "This ain't about coffee, friend." Inside the cafe, the owner had finished his phone call and now stood watching through the window, his arms crossed. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the patio. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered at a safe distance, some recording with their phones, others just watching with concerned expressions. "I think," Ray continued, still seated but subtly adjusting his position, "this is about choices. Every morning, we all wake up and choose what kind of day we're going to have, what kind of person we're going to be." His words carried no threat, but something in his tone made the youngest biker take a small step back. The leader, frustrated by his target's composure, grabbed the back of an empty chair. Pretty words from someone who's about to learn a hard lesson about respect. He started to pull the chair away, but Ray's hand shot out with surprising speed, holding it in place. The movement was smooth, controlled, and spoke of years of training. "Respect," Ray said, still holding the chair with an iron grip, "is earned, not taken." For the first time, a hint of steel entered his voice. The leader tried to yank the chair free, but found it unnaturally solid, like trying to move a boulder. His face reddened with the effort and growing embarrassment. The other two bikers exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't going according to their usual script. The man they'd picked as an easy target was proving to be anything but, and something about his bearing was setting off warning bells in their minds. The younger one's hand strayed to his pocket, but Ray's gaze snapped to the movement instantly, making him freeze. A breeze stirred the napkins on nearby tables, carrying with it the distant sound of sirens. But before any police could arrive, the situation was about to shift dramatically. The leader, his pride stinging from the chair incident, decided to up the ante. He released the chair and reached across the table, aiming to grab Ray's collar. That's when everything changed. Ray's free hand moved with lightning precision, not to strike, but to grip the leader's outstretched wrist. The hold looked gentle, but made the larger man's eyes widen in surprise and discomfort. "I wouldn't," Ray said softly, his grip unwavering. "You seem like someone who needs that hand for riding." Time seemed to freeze for a moment. The leader found himself caught not just physically, but in the unwavering gaze of someone who had seen far worse situations than this and remained unshaken. In those few seconds, a silent message passed between them. This wasn't going to end the way the bikers had planned. Just then, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Everything okay here, Commander?" The question came from Officer Chen, a regular at the cafe who had just pulled up in her patrol car. She wasn't addressing the bikers or even the gathering crowd. Her eyes were fixed on Ray, and the title she used, Commander, hung in the air like a thunderclap. The leader's face drained of color as realization began to dawn. He'd made a serious miscalculation, one that was about to become even more apparent. The morning sun caught something on Ray's jacket as he slowly released the man's wrist, a small pin that, to those who knew what to look for, told a very different story about the man they'd chosen to harass. The bikers, still not fully grasping the situation, decided to push their luck one final time. The leader yanked his hand back, trying to save face in front of his companions. "Commander of what?" The local knitting circle. He forced a laugh that came out more like a nervous bark. The others joined in half-heartedly, but their eyes kept darting between Ray and the police officer. "Look at him with his fancy cane," the youngest one chimed in, desperately trying to maintain their tough image. "Bet he can't even stand up straight." The words hung in the air like smoke, bitter and acrid. The morning sun caught the silver handle of Ray's cane, making it gleam like polished steel. Ray remained seated, his posture relaxed but alert. To the untrained eye, he might have looked vulnerable. But Officer Chen noticed how his breathing remained steady, how his hands stayed open and ready, how his eyes continuously scanned his surroundings. These were the habits of someone who had operated in the world's most dangerous places. The cafe owner had stepped outside now, coffee pot still in hand. He'd served in Vietnam decades ago, and something in Ray's bearing spoke to him. He recognized the calm focus that came from real combat experience. Perhaps, he called out to the bikers, "You gentlemen would like to reconsider your choices this morning." But the leader was too far committed to back down now. He reached for Ray's breakfast plate, intending to throw it aside. "We don't take suggestions from." His words cut off abruptly as his hand froze mid-reach. Nobody had seen Ray move, but somehow his fingers were now locked around the leader's wrist again, this time with unmistakable purpose. You know, Ray said conversationally, as if discussing the weather, in my line of work, we learned that appearances can be deceiving. His grip remained steady, not painful but completely immovable. A calm sea can hide deep currents. A clear sky can harbor fierce storms. Each word carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. The other two bikers shifted uncomfortably. Something was different about this man, the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he controlled the situation without seeming to exert any effort. Their usual intimidation tactics felt childish now, like bringing water pistols to a battleship fight. Officer Chen stayed back, her hand nowhere near her weapon. She'd dealt with Ray before and knew he had the situation well in hand. More patrol cars were approaching in the distance, their sirens silent but lights flashing. The morning traffic slowed as drivers rubbernecked at the scene unfolding outside the cafe. The cane, Ray continued, still holding the lever's wrist, isn't from a golf accident or a car crash. It's from a helicopter rescue mission in rough weather. We saved 3 sailors that night, but our Black Hawk went down in the process. His voice remained level, but his eyes held the kind of intensity that comes from facing death and emerging stronger. A small crowd had gathered now, including several veterans who recognized the significance of the pin on Ray's lapel. One of them, a former Marine, stepped forward slightly, ready to help if needed. But Ray gave him a slight nod. He had this under control. The youngest biker, trying to salvage their reputation, reached for his pocket again. Maybe you don't understand who we. His words died in his throat as Ray's gaze locked onto him. In that moment, the young man realized he was dealing with someone who had faced far worse threats than a few bikers playing tough. 8 combat deployments, Ray said quietly. 15 years in the teams. I understand perfectly who you are and what you're trying to do. Each word carried the weight of countless missions, endless training, and the kind of experience that couldn't be faked. The question is, do you understand who you're dealing with? A gust of wind swept through the cafe patio, stirring the spilled coffee on the table. The leader's face had lost its aggressive sneer, replaced by a dawning recognition. His eyes fixed on Ray's lapel pin, the SEAL trident that marked him as a member of one of the most elite fighting forces in the world. In that moment, the dynamic shifted completely. The bikers weren't just facing a man with a cane anymore. They were standing before someone who had earned his place among warriors, someone who had faced real battles and emerged not just alive, but wise. The morning sun seemed to grow brighter, illuminating the truth of their terrible mistake. Officer Chen's presence had changed everything in an instant. More patrol cars quietly pulled up to the curb, their lights casting gentle red and blue reflections on the cafe windows. But it wasn't the police presence that had transformed the situation, it was that single word, Commander. The leader of the bikers took a small step back, his eyes now fixed on Ray's lapel pin. The morning sun caught the gold surface of the SEAL trident, making it shine like a beacon. Recognition dawned on his face as years of military knowledge came flooding back. He'd served 2 years ago, and he knew exactly what that pin meant. His voice trailed off, the tough guy act evaporating like morning dew. The other bikers looked confused, not understanding the sudden change in their leader's demeanor. They'd seen him back down from nothing before, but now he looked like he'd seen a ghost. Ray adjusted his jacket slightly, letting the trident pin become more visible. SEAL Team 3, he said quietly, not as a boast but as a simple statement of fact. 15 years, 8 deployments. Retired after a helicopter crash during a rescue mission. His voice carried no anger, no threat, just the steady certainty of someone who had faced real challenges. The cafe owner had stepped closer, coffee pot still in hand. His eyes showed recognition. He'd served alongside special forces in Vietnam and knew the weight that Ray's words carried. Other veterans in the growing crowd nodded silently, understanding flowing between them like an invisible current. I was Army, the leader admitted, his voice completely changed. 82nd Airborne years ago. The admission seemed to physically deflate him, like air escaping from a balloon. His companions exchanged confused looks, not understanding how their morning of intimidation had turned into this strange moment of connection. Ray nodded, acknowledging the service without commentary. Then you know what it means to wear the uniform. To serve something bigger than yourself. His words carried no judgment, just a reminder of shared values long forgotten. The youngest biker, still not fully grasping the situation, started to say something tough, but the leader silenced him with a sharp gesture. "Stand down," he ordered, using military language that felt natural again after all these years. "Just stand down." More veterans had gathered now, drawn by some sixth sense that told them one of their own needed support. They formed a loose circle around the scene, not threatening but present. Among them were former Marines, Air Force pilots, Army grunts, a living testament to the brotherhood of service that transcended years and branches. "I didn't know," the leader started to say, but Ray cut him off with a gentle wave. "You weren't supposed to know," he said. "That's not why I'm here. I'm just a guy having breakfast, same as anyone else." He gestured to the spilled coffee. "Though I could use a fresh cup now." The cafe owner was already moving, returning with a fresh coffee pot and clean cups for everyone. The gesture was small but significant, an offering of peace in a moment that could have gone very differently. Officer Chen watched from her position near her patrol car, understanding flowing between her and Ray. She'd seen him defuse situations before at the Veterans Center where he volunteered. This was what real strength looked like, not the ability to hurt, but the wisdom to heal. The morning had grown warmer, the sun now fully above the buildings. Other customers began returning to their tables, sensing that the danger had passed. The bikers' motorcycles no longer seemed threatening, just machines gleaming in the sunlight. The leader struggled visibly with his emotions, years of tough guy persona cracking to reveal something more genuine underneath. His hand moved unconsciously to touch his own jacket, where a similar pin might have rested years ago in a different life. "Commander," he said finally, the title now filled with respect rather than mockery, "I think we owe you more than an apology." His voice caught slightly, carrying the weight of recognition, not just of Ray's service, but of how far he himself had strayed from the values he once upheld. A gentle breeze stirred the napkins on the table, carrying with it the possibility of change. Sometimes, Ray knew, the biggest victories came not from defeating an enemy, but from turning one into a friend. The morning had started with conflict, but was transforming into something else entirely, a chance for redemption, for remembering who we really are beneath the masks we wear. The atmosphere around the cafe had transformed completely. Where there had been tension and threat, now there was something different, a quiet understanding that spread like ripples in still water. The leader of the bikers stood straighter now, his posture unconsciously returning to something that resembled military bearing. "It's been years since I thought about who I used to be," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "Sometimes it's easier to forget." His weathered hands, which had been clenched in fists earlier, now hung loose at his sides. The morning sun highlighted the faded military tattoos on his arms, symbols of a past life nearly forgotten. Ray gestured to the empty chairs around his table. "Sit down," he offered. "Coffee's getting cold." The invitation wasn't just about coffee, it was a chance to bridge a gap that had seemed uncrossable just minutes before. The cafe owner was already bringing fresh cups, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood the importance of this moment. The younger bikers watched in confusion as their leader pulled out a chair and sat down. They'd never seen him like this before, the tough exterior cracking to reveal glimpses of someone else underneath. Someone who had once stood for something bigger than intimidation and fear. "I was there too," the leader said after a moment, wrapping his hands around the warm coffee cup. "Not like you. I was just regular Army, but I was there." His voice carried the weight of memories long buried. Coming back, it wasn't easy. Still isn't sometimes. Other veterans in the crowd began sharing quiet nods of understanding. One by one, they drifted closer, drawn by the invisible bond that connected those who had served. Officer Chen stepped back, holstering her radio. She knew this wasn't about law enforcement anymore. "The hardest battle," Ray said, taking a sip of his fresh coffee, "is the one we fight with ourselves when we come home." His words resonated with truth earned through experience. Finding a new purpose, remembering who we are beneath the uniform, that's the real challenge. The youngest biker, who had been shifting uncomfortably, finally spoke up. "I don't understand," he said, his previous bravado replaced by genuine confusion. "What's happening here?" The leader looked at him with new eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time how young he really was. "What's happening is we almost made a terrible mistake today," he said. "We forgot who we were supposed to be." His voice carried a mix of shame and awakening. Ray watched as understanding began to dawn on the younger men's faces. This was the real power of transformation, not through force or fear, but through recognition of shared humanity. The morning had grown warmer, but it wasn't just the sun that had changed the temperature of this gathering. More coffee appeared, and with it came stories. The leader spoke of his time in the service, of battles fought and friends lost. The tough exterior melted away, revealing a man who had once stood proud in uniform, who had once lived by a code of honor and service. "We came here looking for trouble," he admitted, shaking his head. "Instead, we found a reminder of who we used to be." His companions listened silently, witnessing a side of their leader they'd never seen before. The cafe had become oddly quiet, other customers watching this unexpected scene unfold. The bikers' motorcycles gleamed in the parking lot, no longer symbols of intimidation, but just machines in the morning sun. "It's never too late," Ray said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of experience, "to remember who you really are, to find that sense of purpose again." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a card. "The Veterans Center where I volunteer, we're always open to anyone who wants to find their way back." The leader took the card with hands that trembled slightly. Years of built-up anger and confusion seemed to be cracking, like ice breaking up in spring. His younger companions watched, uncertain but sensing that something important was happening. A gentle breeze stirred the napkins on the table, carrying with it the sounds of the city waking up. But here, in this small corner of the world, something more than just the day was awakening. It was the stirring of forgotten values, of buried honor finding its way back to the surface. 2 weeks had passed since that transformative morning at the cafe. The autumn sun painted the Veterans Center parking lot in warm golden light as Ray pulled up for his regular volunteer shift. He noticed a familiar motorcycle parked near the entrance, clean and shining, no longer meant to intimidate. Inside, the leader of the bikers, now known by his real name Tom, was helping set up chairs for the morning support group. His leather vest was still there, but the questionable patches had been replaced with his old military unit insignia. He looked up as Ray entered, offering a nod of respect that meant more than words could say. "Commander," Tom greeted, his voice carrying none of the mockery it had held that morning at the cafe. "Got 3 new guys coming in today." He gestured toward the coffee station he helped set up. "Thought maybe you could talk to them about transition, about finding a new path." The change in Tom over these 2 weeks had been remarkable. After that morning at the cafe, he'd not only started coming to the Veterans Center himself, but had begun bringing other vets who needed help. His knowledge of the local biker community had turned out to be invaluable. He knew exactly who was struggling, who needed support but was too proud to ask. "The young kid who was with me that day," Tom said, adjusting a chair, "he's not a vet, but his father was. Never came back from overseas." He paused, emotion crossing his weathered face. "Been trying to show him there's better ways to honor his dad's memory than causing trouble." Ray set his cane against the wall and started helping with the chairs. His legs still bothered him, but the pain seemed less important now. Every person who walked through these doors seeking help made it worthwhile. The morning group session was larger than usual. Word had spread through the veteran community about how a potential fight had turned into something positive. People were curious, drawn by the story of transformation. Among them sat Tom's younger companions, their tough exteriors softened by uncertainty and hope. "You know what really got to me that day?" Tom spoke up during the session. "It wasn't just realizing who you were, Commander. It was remembering who I used to be, who I still am underneath everything else." His words resonated around the room, touching others who had lost their way after leaving the service. The cafe owner had started donating coffee and pastries to the Veterans Center. He said it was good business sense, but everyone knew it was more than that. His cafe had become a sort of unofficial meeting point where veterans could find support and understanding. Officer Chen stopped by regularly too, not as law enforcement but as part of the community. She'd seen too many confrontations end badly and was grateful to have witnessed one that led to healing instead of harm. As the weeks passed, more changes became visible. Tom's motorcycle club started organizing rides for veteran charity events. The younger members began helping at the Veterans Center, learning about service and brotherhood in its truest form. The tough guy image remained, but now it protected something meaningful instead of masking pain. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes, Ray told a new group member one morning. If you're willing to be honest about who you are and who you want to be. He glanced at Tom, who was mentoring another veteran through a rough patch. The strength we learned in service, it was never about domination. It was about protection, about standing up for something bigger than ourselves. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Veterans Center, highlighting the American flag on the wall. Below it hung photos of service members from different eras, a reminder that every generation faced its own battles, both in war and in coming home. Tom's voice carried across the room as he shared his story with a new arrival. I thought I'd lost that part of myself, he was saying. The part that stood for something good. But sometimes you need someone to remind you of who you really are. The center had become more than just a meeting place. It was a sanctuary where tough exteriors could soften, where old wounds could begin to heal, where veterans could remember the best parts of their service, the brotherhood, the purpose, the sense of standing for something greater than themselves. And it had all started with a simple morning, a cup of coffee, and the courage to see past appearances to the truth that lay beneath. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating an enemy, but from turning a potential adversary into an ally, a stranger into a friend, a lost soul into someone who has found their way home again.